The threat of a third world war has never been higher, and if you live in any of the places on our list, we got bad news for you, because your odds of surviving are slim. Our first global hotspot for World War III is the Indian-Pakistan border. These two nations have a long-standing sibling rivalry that's seen the two nations go to war multiple times over the last 70 years. The root of the conflict
7 years against the war.
comes from the liberation of India and Pakistan by Britain, and the subsequent fallout over who owns what territory. For the most part, the territory in question was Kashmir, with the newly formed Pakistan fearful that local rulers would pledge their allegiance to India. Thus, Pakistan initiated an offensive into Kashmir via tribal militias to attempt to take the territory before local rulers joined India. Since then, India and Pakistan have fought 4 official wars with numerous other smaller-scale conflicts, with Pakistan being frequently defeated by the far superior Indian military, who in recent years has turned to the use of terrorism to strike inside of India. Officially, Pakistan doesn't support any form of terrorism. Unofficially, Pakistan has been thoroughly tied to various terrorist groups and militias by both India, Britain, and the US, to name a few countries. Famously, it even helped arm and train terrorist fighters during the US occupation of Afghanistan, even providing them with shelter across their border, where
Afghanistan. It is horrible in Afghanistan. It is the Taliban. Yeah, so they've came from the Taliban, which are bad.
US troops couldn't pursue. When US forces launched joint raids inside Pakistan against terrorist strongholds, more often than not, their targets were missing, having been mysteriously forewarned of a pending raid. On the 13th of December 2001, Pakistan-backed terrorist groups carried out an attack on
22 years
the Indian parliament, bringing the two to the brink of war. In 2008, Pakistan-backed terrorists once more carried out a bombing and mass shooting campaign inside of India, and Pakistan mobilized its forces in anticipation of a declaration of war by India. Since then, the two sides have engaged in a series of border skirmishes, with hostilities heating
Why can't we just be mates? Like, what a country.
Up again in 2019 to 2021, leading to Indian airstrikes inside Pakistan shooting down an Indian plane, and artillery and rifle fire being exchanged by both sides. Now the two sides are closer to an all-out war than they've been in decades, and it could be the last war either side wages. Both nations possess nuclear weapons, with India having 160 versus Pakistan's 165. India has a no first-use policy and will only use its weapons in retaliation to a nuclear attack against itself or its forces. Pakistan, however, does maintain a first strike policy, though with the stipulation that it will only use nuclear weapons if it's unable to repel an invasion or if it's attacked first with nuclear weapons. While a full-blown exchange would be devastating, even a partial exchange will still lead to millions of deaths.
Yeah. I'm literally in the middle of doing a video again. I'm literally in the middle of doing a video. Give me 10 minutes. I'll see. 10 minutes and I'll go down. Fine, 5 minutes. Shut my door.
Thanks to the population density of both nations. So, where are the worst places to be in case of a war? India's strategy for defeating Pakistan involves carrying out rapid deep strike penetrations into Pakistani territory. The objective for India's armed forces is to penetrate so deep so quickly that if Pakistan decided to use nuclear weapons, it would be forced to do so on its own soil. So anywhere along India-Pakistan border would be a death trap for civilians. Pakistan would receive the brunt of the nuclear strikes as panic-ridden.
We know you're hovering over that button, but we need your help. We have a better button, we promise. Right on time.
Ridden Pakistani commanders turned to nuclear weapons to try to repel India's superior forces. However, the moment nuclear weapons were used against Indian forces, there's an extremely good chance that India will escalate the conflict by launching its own nuclear attacks against Pakistani military targets, including major military bases and installations. It's unlikely this first wave of attacks would target population centers as a way of attempting to prevent further escalation, and rather would be a tit-for-tat nuclear exchange. The problem comes if Pakistan decides that it wishes to further escalate by retaliating against these attacks, leaving it with only one option: use its limited arsenal against Indian cities. This will seal Pakistan's fate as India's own arsenal wipes out Pakistan's major population centers. Thankfully, both nations possess a very limited stockpile of nuclear arms and would not likely use all of them against each other in order to leave some left over for a future deterrent. However, even with an exchange of several dozen nuclear weapons, hundreds of millions would still die from the initial explosions and the subsequent societal collapse across the subcontinent in the weeks to follow. Massive radioactive plumes of fallout will drift into the winds east and north, even penetrating into China, and skyrocketing cancer cases across southern and central China. However, the effects of this war would be global. If both sides engaged in a nuclear exchange, the resulting smoke and debris would linger in the stratosphere for an estimated 5 years.
5 years.
According to a 2019 study, global temperatures would drop by as much as 5 degrees Celsius and cause a global precipitation loss of up to 30%. This would trigger a mini ice age and make it very difficult for food to be grown around the world, especially in India, China, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, tropical South America, and Africa. Mass global starvation would follow, and the Earth's population could be slashed nearly in half, with most of the worst effects being felt in less developed nations
Like 8 billion people to 4 billion. That is.
who'd be very poorly suited for weathering the effects. But even if the conflict
Last time the Earth had 4 billion people was in the 1920s.
remained conventional, living anywhere in eastern Pakistan where most of the fighting would take place would be deadly. Pakistan has no hope of
Not 1920, like 1950.
threatening Indian cities with conventional firepower, but India, on the other hand, could easily overwhelm Pakistani forces and drive the fighting into Pakistani cities. As neither military has a heavy investment in smart weapons, the fighting would mostly involve dumb, unguided munitions, which would result in extreme collateral damage. While India would easily weather the fighting, Pakistan would be internally devastated by picking yet another fight against its much bigger neighbor. For our next worst place to be in the case of World War III, we're remaining on the Indian subcontinent, but this time looking north. China and India have as fraught relations as India and Pakistan, and once more it all comes down to disputed borders. Neither side acknowledges the other's claims along the Himalayas. This has always resulted in a border stalemate that often turns violent, though in very unexpected ways. Originally, border conflicts resulted in full-blown military action on both sides, with one very brief war being fought between the two in 1962. Since then, in an attempt to temper growing hostilities, both sides eventually came to a sort of agreement. Rifles and explosives would not be used in any skirmish between the two sides' border forces. This has led to an interesting reversal back to the medieval era, as Indian and Chinese troops armed themselves with all manner of improvised clubs, maces, and even blunted spears. The two sides have taken to frequently exchanging insults and throwing rocks at one another. However, recently violent incidents, including exchanging of gunfire, have grown more frequent, and a Sino-Indian war might be on the horizon. The good news is such a conflict is unlikely to go nuclear, but the bad news is that even if it remains a conventional one, both sides will experience much suffering. Initially, there would be little impact to civilians, as most of the fighting is done along the northern border. In fact, the scale of fighting would be relatively small, given the fact that the terrain is not suitable for heavy equipment, and providing close air support at such high elevation is very problematic for both sides. However, India would almost certainly attempt to infiltrate Chinese-occupied Tibet and initiate a local uprising against Chinese troops. The Tibetan people have been occupied by the Chinese since 1949, and despite a robust effort to destroy the Tibetan national identity, many in the region resent the occupation. Tibet would see brutal crackdowns by Chinese troops, especially as they control all media in the region, and there's no way for the world to hold them accountable like in Hong Kong, which has a large presence of foreign media. The real pain, though, would start when India uses its navy to shut down Chinese trade in the South Pacific, crippling China economically. Despite having a superior navy, China's navy is still not well suited for carrying out operations far from its own shores, and there would be little the country could do to prevent an Indian blockade of its trade through the Indian Ocean. Ships could reroute to avoid the Indian Navy further south, but this will add time and dramatically increase shipping costs for vital necessities such as petrochemicals from the Middle East. China might be the worst place to be in case of a Sino-Indian war. as while the conflict is unlikely to have high numbers of civilian casualties, it will economically ravage China when it's most vulnerable due to the pending retirement crisis the country faces. With more old workers retiring than new workers replacing them, the Chinese economy could take a massive nosedive, undoing decades of hard work to become a global powerhouse. There is, however, one place China could start World War III and make the locals suffer greatly: Taiwan. It's an independent island nation just off the coast of China, and has been ever since the Chinese nationalists fled from the communists at the end of World War II. Today, the nation is an island fortress that's invested heavily in its defense because of one simple fact: China wants it back, and it wants it back very, very soon. President Xi Jinping has made it clear that the continued Taiwanese independence is out of the question, and yet local polls show that only a very small minority favor reunification with China. This leaves President Xi with only one choice: reunification by force. And the Chinese Navy has been preparing for just that role over a decade now, adding dozens of amphibious warfare vessels to its growing fleet. Tiny Taiwan might look completely outmatched, but has massive geographic advantages that would make an invasion extremely costly. However, it also has the support.
Eve to me is basically freedom. It's a giant open universe where you can do whatever you want. You can have really relaxed.
The support of the most powerful nation on earth, the United States of America, with President Biden reaffirming that the U.S. is committed to the defense of the island democracy. This means that President Xi's ambitions to reunify Taiwan by force puts it on a collision course with America. The worst place to be in the case of a South Pacific World War III would be Taiwan itself, as the island nation would inevitably be overrun with Chinese troops. However, the effort to neutralize the island would take months, if not years, and the Chinese military would be forced into brutal house-to-house fighting inside modern high-rise cities, a logistical nightmare for any military. China, which is not known for its restraint, is likely to respond the same way Russia has in Ukraine, with indiscriminate bombing campaigns meant to destroy urban defenders and demoralize the population. Massive swaths of the island nation would be completely destroyed by the fighting, resulting in the killing of thousands and the displacement of hundreds of thousands who'd have no way of escaping the island. There is the possibility that China would allow humanitarian transport back to the mainland for Taiwanese refugees. But given China's treatment of the Uyghur people, we could expect to see these refugees rounded up and interred in prison camps for political indoctrination and retraining.
Horrible what they do in China. I'm sorry. They're just really horrible.
But if you live in Guam or near US bases in Japan and South Korea, life would probably suck for you too. That's thanks to the hundreds of missiles that China will expend in an effort to destroy US air and naval capabilities in the region. With the world's largest rocket and missile forces, China has hundreds of ballistic missiles all aimed at major US naval and air bases across the Pacific. And most of these missiles have a very large error radius, putting civilian targets near military assets at severe risk. Once more, though, living inside China is bound to suck for you in case of a war in the Pacific, because the US Navy can and absolutely would blockade Chinese trade, choking off 60% of its imports and most of its exports. Financially starved, the Chinese economy would tank over the coming months, with an expected GDP loss of up to 35% for the Chinese economy over the long term versus 15% for the US. The conflict wouldn't likely turn nuclear, but for our next two conflicts, the use of nuclear weapons is all but certain. Next on our tour of the worst places to live in case of World War III is the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. All three are former Soviet republics, and all three are in the crosshairs of Vladimir Putin, who wished to restore the former glory of the Soviet Union. Putin's judgment is questionable, given his handling of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but he's unlikely to declare all-out war against NATO by invading the Baltics. Instead, analysts have warned for years that Putin could try to undermine the alliance by making micro-aggressive moves into the former Soviet republics, such as, for example, seizing one or two towns or villages along the Russian border. This would, in essence, dare NATO to declare all-out war over what is, in essence, an insignificant military incursion against an alliance member. However, NATO has made it clear that it's ready and willing to fight for every single inch of NATO territory. A war over the Baltics would turn very bad very quickly for locals. Russian forces vastly outnumber NATO forces in the region, with the bastion of NATO power being located in Poland or further west, despite the creation of...
Sorry, I fell asleep there. But yeah, basically, the Russian wants to regain the Soviet Union.
a rapid reaction force, and a very rapid reaction force, no NATO member realistically expects for the Baltics to be defensible against a full-scale Russian invasion. This leaves the Baltic citizens at the mercy of Russian occupiers. And as we have seen time and again in Ukraine, this means vast amounts of abuse and outright war crimes, especially as frustrated Russian troops underperform against NATO forces. Local populations would be subjected to great amounts of unguided airstrikes and artillery bombardments, with many of those actions taken against civilian targets on purpose. Rather than fighting a conventional conflict, the Russian